the asteroid was supposed to be worthless, which was exactly why Kettrik Voss Ambrai had bought the mining rights to it for less than the cost of the drill he intended to use on it. Kettrik was Drevathi, a species whose entire economy ran on the patient, unglamorous business of cracking open rocks nobody else wanted, sorting through billions of tons of debris, drifting through unclaimed space in the hope that somewhere inside one of them sat enough rare metal to make the years of labor worthwhile. He had done this work for 32 cycles, long enough to develop the particular kind of tired, practical instincts that came from a career spent disappointed more often than not, and long enough to know that an asteroid this deep in a dead system, this far from any charted trade route, should have contained nothing more interesting than iron and ice. The survey scan, when it finally returned a result worth looking at twice, did not show him metal deposits or mineral veins. It showed him a hollow. "Run it again," he told his ship system, a modest, aging intelligence he had never bothered to name because naming things cost money he preferred to spend on fuel. "That reading can't be right. Solid rock doesn't hollow itself out." The scan returned the same result a second time, and a third, each pass revealing more detail than the last. A cavity roughly 11 kilometers across, buried nearly 2 kilometers beneath the asteroid's cratered surface. Its internal structure far too regular, far too deliberately shaped, to be anything but artificial. Kettrik sat back in his cramped pilot's seat and stared at the display for a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo that came from having spent 32 cycles building an entire understanding of how the universe worked, only to have a single sensor reading quietly suggest that understanding had been incomplete the whole time. "There's something built inside this rock," he said slowly, to no one in particular, since his ship system had no capacity for conversation beyond basic operational reporting. "Something old enough that it's had time to accumulate 2 kilometers of impact debris on top of it, and big enough that whoever built it wasn't hiding something small." He had two choices, as he understood them. He could report the anomaly to the nearest Drevathi survey authority, as regulation technically required for any discovery of potential archaeological significance, and wait the several months it would likely take for a proper expedition to be authorized, funded, and dispatched, during which time any number of other prospectors working the same dead system might stumble across the same reading and claim the discovery for themselves. Or he could do what 32 cycles of hard-won instinct told him made considerably more practical sense: crack the rock open carefully himself, document exactly what he found, and let the discovery's significance speak for itself once it was already secured under his own claim. He chose the second option, not entirely for noble reasons, he would admit later, but because he had spent his entire adult life learning that value discovered and reported too slowly had a way of becoming someone else's value entirely. It took him 6 days of careful, methodical drilling, working with a patience his younger colleagues sometimes mocked him for, to open a passage wide enough to fly his small survey shuttle through without risking a structural collapse that might bury whatever he had found forever. He remembered vividly the exact moment his shuttle's forward lights finally broke through into open space on the other side of the rock, illuminating not the smooth, empty cavity he had half expected, but something that made him kill his shuttle's thrusters entirely and simply sit, frozen, staring through the viewport in complete silence. Buildings. Actual buildings, rising in orderly rows across the cavity's curved interior surface, their architecture unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably inhabited once, arranged along streets that curved gently to follow the asteroid's internal contour, lit faintly by something that still, impossibly, generated a soft ambient glow after however many centuries had passed since anyone had last walked those streets. "This isn't a ruin," Kettrik said quietly, his voice carrying an awe he had not felt since he was young enough to still find rocks fascinating rather than merely profitable. This is a city. He had no idea in that moment, drifting slowly through the cavernous, impossible space he had just cracked open, that the city was human, that it had been sealed inside this asteroid deliberately rather than by accident, or that the discovery he had just made would eventually place him at the center of a diplomatic crisis, considerably larger than any prospector had ever anticipated finding inside a rock he had bought for almost nothing. He guided his shuttle carefully down toward what appeared to be a central plaza, close enough to the largest structure in the cavity, a building whose scale and positioning suggested some kind of civic or governmental purpose, and set down on a flat stretch of open ground with the careful, deliberate touch of a pilot who understood he was landing somewhere considerably more significant than any survey site he had ever worked before. The silence, when he finally cut his engines and stepped outside in his environmental suit, pressed in around him with a weight that felt almost physical. His suit's external sensors registered breathable atmosphere, a detail that struck him as strange enough to warrant immediate attention, since a sealed cavity buried 2 kilometers beneath an asteroid's surface should not, by any conventional understanding of physics he possessed, still maintain a stable, breathable atmospheric composition after however long this place had been abandoned. "Unless it hasn't been abandoned as long as I assumed," he murmured to himself, adjusting his suit's readings carefully, "or unless something is still actively maintaining it." He walked slowly through the plaza, past structures whose design language he did not recognize from any Drevathi archive he had ever studied, past what appeared to be public benches and small planted gardens, long since overgrown into wild, tangled greenery that had nonetheless clearly once been tended with deliberate care. He found, near the plaza's center, a raised platform bearing an inscription in characters he did not recognize, though something in their careful, geometric structure struck him as oddly familiar, the way a word in an unfamiliar language sometimes carries an echo of one you already know. It was as he stood before that inscription, trying to make sense of characters that felt maddeningly close to legible without ever quite resolving into meaning, that the lights of the plaza around him flickered, dimmed, and then brightened again, and a voice, calm and measured and entirely unexpected, spoke from a source he could not immediately identify. "Unauthorized entry detected," the voice said, in a language his suit's translation matrix processed instantly, though the underlying speech pattern carried a strange, formal cadence unlike anything in his archive. "Please identify yourself and state your intentions before proceeding further into the sanctuary." Kettrik froze completely, every instinct honed across 32 cycles of careful prospecting screaming at him that whatever had just spoken was not a ruin, not a dead artifact triggering some ancient automated recording, but something considerably more alert and considerably more aware of his presence than any archaeological site had any right to be. "I am Kettrik Voss Ambrai," he said carefully, forcing his voice steady, "an independent prospector operating under legal Drevathi mining claim. I did not know this place existed before I opened a passage into it 6 days ago. I have no hostile intentions." There was a pause, long enough that Kettrik began to wonder if the voice had simply been an automated recording after all, triggered by his presence but incapable of genuine response. Then it spoke again, and this time something in its tone had shifted, less procedural, more careful, the sound of something choosing its next words with evident deliberation. "You are the first visitor the sanctuary has recorded in 417 years, the voice said. "Please remain where you are. I am initiating contact protocols that have not been used in considerably longer than that. This may take a moment." Kettrik remained exactly where he was, standing before an inscription he could not read, in a plaza built by hands he had never encountered, waiting for whatever came next with the particular stillness of a man who understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that he had just stumbled into something far larger than any mineral claim. The lights around the plaza brightened further, and a section of the wall behind the raised platform began, with a soft mechanical hum, to slide aside, revealing an entrance that had clearly been sealed for a very long time, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust that spilled outward as the mechanism finally, reluctantly, completed its motion. "Please enter," the voice said. "The sanctuary's keeper intelligence is prepared to speak with you directly, though I should warn you, Prospector, that what you are about to learn will likely raise considerably more questions than it answers." If you're finding this discovery as fascinating as we are, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more listeners who love a good first contact tale. And we'd love to know, if you cracked open an asteroid expecting rare metals and found an entire hidden city instead, would you report it immediately to the authorities? Or would you go inside first to see exactly what you'd found before anyone else? You could claim it. Drop your answer in the comments. We read every one. Now back to Kettrik, standing at the threshold of a door that hadn't opened in over 4 centuries. The chamber beyond the door was smaller than Kettrik expected, circular, lined with softly glowing panels whose light cast no shadows he could clearly identify. And at its center stood a simple pedestal atop which a small, faceted crystal pulsed gently with a rhythm that reminded him, uncomfortably, of a heartbeat. "I am the keeper," the voice said, emanating now clearly from the crystal itself. "I have maintained the sanctuary and its dormant population for the entirety of its concealment. I did not expect, Prospector, that the first visitor to breach that concealment would arrive not as an enemy, but as someone genuinely uncertain of what he had found. That uncertainty, I think, is the only reason I am speaking with you at all rather than initiating a considerably more defensive protocol." "Dormant population," Kettrik repeated slowly, the words settling over him with a weight he had not anticipated. "You mean there are people here, actual people, not just a city?" 211,406, the keeper said. "Held in a form of deep suspension our engineers developed specifically for this purpose, a state considerably more stable and considerably more sustainable across long timescales than conventional cryogenic methods your species may be familiar with. They have slept, Prospector, for 417 years, waiting for a signal that has never come." "Waiting for what signal?" "Confirmation," the keeper said, "that it was finally safe to wake." Kettrik felt the full strangeness of his situation settle over him completely, standing in a chamber built to safeguard over 200,000 sleeping people, addressed by an intelligence that had apparently maintained that vigil alone for over 4 centuries. "Safe from what?" he asked. "What were you hiding from?" "That," the keeper said, "requires context I suspect you do not currently possess. Are you familiar, Prospector, with the species your archives likely refer to as extinct humanity?" Kettrik felt something cold settle in his chest, the particular disorientation of hearing a term from ancient Drevathi historical study applied, suddenly and directly, to a living, waiting reality rather than a closed chapter in some archive. "Humanity went extinct," he said slowly. "Every record I've ever studied treats that as settled history, a species that expanded too quickly and collapsed under its own weight several thousand years ago." "That is the account that survived," the keeper said. "It is not the account that is true. I would ask you, Prospector, before I explain further, whether you intend to report this discovery to your Drevathi authorities regardless of what I tell you next. I do not ask to prevent you from doing so. I ask because the answer will shape how much I choose to share with you before that reporting inevitably occurs." Kettrik considered the question carefully, understanding, with the particular clarity that came from 32 cycles spent evaluating the true worth of things other people dismissed too quickly, that his answer mattered considerably more than a simple prospector's claim filing ever had before. "I intend to report it," he said finally. "Not because regulation requires it, though it does, but because I don't think a discovery this significant belongs hidden inside one prospector's private claim forever. But I'd like to understand what I'm reporting before I do, so that whatever comes next happens because the truth was explained clearly, rather than because a scared bureaucrat panicked over an anomaly they didn't understand. Something in the crystal's pulsing rhythm shifted, slower, more deliberate. In a manner Kettrik found himself reading, despite having no real basis for doing so, as something like relief. "Then I will tell you everything," the keeper said. "And I will ask, when you finish listening, that you consider carrying this sanctuary's message forward yourself, rather than simply filing a claim and stepping back to let others decide what happens to the people sleeping beneath your feet." The keeper's explanation unfolded slowly, methodically, in the manner of an intelligence that had spent 417 years alone with nothing but its own careful records for company, and had perhaps forgotten, in that long solitude, how urgently a listener might want the story told more quickly. 417 years ago, the keeper explained, humanity had existed as a modest but growing spacefaring civilization, holding several dozen systems, engaged in careful, cautious diplomacy with the wider galactic community it had only recently joined. This was not, the keeper clarified, the ancient humanity of Drevathi archives, the species presumed extinct millennia past following its mysterious long wit. H. This was a considerably more recent chapter, humanity's slow, careful reemergence into galactic society following an ancient period of enforced hiding, a chapter Kettrik's own archives, he realized with mounting unease, apparently did not record at all. "You did not know humanity had ever resurfaced," the keeper observed, watching Kettrik's expression carefully. "That does not surprise me. What happened 417 years ago was designed, quite deliberately, to ensure that very few records of humanity's brief return to galactic prominence would survive to trouble the wider public consciousness." "What happened?" Kettrik asked. "War," the keeper said simply. "Not a war humanity started, and not in the end, a war humanity won outright, though it did not lose entirely either. A coalition of established powers, threatened by humanity's rapid reintegration into galactic trade and governance following its long isolation, moved to eliminate what they perceived as an emerging threat before it could grow further. The conflict lasted 11 years, cost humanity several of its outer colonies entirely, and ended not in humanity's destruction, but in an uneasy, carefully negotiated settlement that required, among its many painful terms, humanity's formal withdrawal from several regions of contested space, and the quiet, permanent concealment of a significant portion of its remaining population." Kettrik absorbed this slowly. "Concealment, you mean the people sleeping here?" "I mean precisely that," the keeper said. "This sanctuary was constructed in the war's final years, as both a refuge and a contingency, populated by evacuees from 3 colonies that had been rendered uninhabitable during the conflict, engineers and archivists and ordinary families alike, sealed inside this asteroid and placed into deep suspension under my care, with instructions to wake only upon receiving a specific authorization signal from humanity's surviving governing authority, confirming that conditions had finally stabilized enough to permit their safe return to active galactic life. And that signal never came." "It never came," the keeper confirmed. "I do not know, Prospector, whether that is because humanity's surviving government was itself eventually dismantled or absorbed into the settlement's terms in ways that made such a signal impossible to transmit, or whether some catastrophe I have no record of simply prevented its delivery, or whether, in the confusion and secrecy surrounding the war's conclusion, this sanctuary was quietly forgotten by the very people who built it. Its location lost amid the chaos of a hastily negotiated peace. I have maintained my vigil regardless, for 417 years, monitoring what external communications I could safely intercept without revealing my own location, hoping eventually to learn enough to make an independent judgment about whether it was finally safe to proceed without the authorization I was built to wait for. And have you learned enough? The keeper's crystal pulsed slowly for a long moment before answering. I have learned that the galaxy has changed considerably since the war that necessitated this sanctuary's construction. I have intercepted references, fragmentary and difficult to verify from this isolated position, suggesting the rise of new governing frameworks, a body called the Concordance Council, apparently organized specifically to prevent exactly the kind of unchecked aggression that led to humanity's original conflict. I have even intercepted, within the last several decades, references to a diplomat named Ape Solis, whose work apparently helped reaffirm certain protections for humanity under very old galactic law. These are hopeful signs, Prospector. They are not, on their own, sufficient confirmation for me to responsibly wake 211,000 people who have trusted me for over 4 centuries to make that judgment correctly. Kettrik felt the enormity of what he was being told settle fully over him now, the sheer weight of responsibility the keeper had carried alone for so long, and the delicate, dangerous position his own discovery had just placed both of them in. "What do you need from me?" he asked quietly. "You said you'd tell me everything if I agreed to carry this forward. What exactly are you asking me to carry?" "I am asking you," the keeper said, "to help me determine, definitively, whether it is finally safe to wake the people in my care, and if so, to help arrange their return to the wider galactic community in a manner that protects them rather than exposes them to whatever risks might still remain. I am asking you, in short, to become the messenger this sanctuary has waited 417 years for, because I no longer believe humanity's original government will ever send the signal I was built to wait for, and I do not believe these people should sleep forever simply because the author I'd meant to wake them no longer exists to do so." Kettrik was, by his own honest assessment, an unremarkable man in most respects, a prospector of modest ambition who had spent 32 cycles learning to recognize value in rocks other people walked past without a second glance. He had never imagined himself as anyone's messenger, had never sought out responsibility of the kind the keeper was now quietly placing into his hands, and yet he found, standing in that softly lit chamber with 211,000 sleeping lives resting somewhere beneath his feet, that he could not simply walk away and let this become someone else's problem. "I'll help," he said, "but I need to understand exactly what verification would satisfy you, so I know what I'm actually looking for once I leave this place." The keeper's response was immediate, precise, the answer of an intelligence that had clearly spent 4 centuries considering exactly this question. "I require confirmation of 3 things," it said. "First, that the coalition responsible for the original conflict no longer holds sufficient power to renew hostilities against a resurfacing human population. Second, that a legitimate galactic governing body, with genuine authority and genuine willingness to enforce it, exists to protect these people should any threat reemerge. Third, and most critically, confirmation from a source I can verify as both trustworthy and appropriately informed, that humanity's broader remaining population, wherever it currently exists, would welcome the return of these 211,000 people rather than viewing their sudden reappearance as a destabilizing complication better left undisturbed." Kettrik considered the scope of what he was being asked to verify, understanding fully, for the first time, exactly how far beyond a simple prospector's claim this discovery had already carried him. "That's not something I can confirm on my own," he admitted. "I don't have access to the kind of diplomatic and political information you're describing. I'm a rock cracker, not an ambassador." "No," the keeper agreed. "But you are, I think, precisely the kind of person capable of finding someone who does have that access, and persuading them the search is worth undertaking honestly, rather than simply for whatever profit or prestige this discovery might otherwise offer them. I have observed enough of the wider galaxy's communications, even from this isolated position, to understand that most who might stumble across a discovery like this would be tempted to treat it as leverage, a bargaining chip to be sold to the highest bidder rather than a responsibility to be carried faithfully. You have already demonstrated, in agreeing to help before securing any promise of reward, that you may be an exception to that pattern. Kettrik left the sanctuary 3 days later, having spent that time walking its quiet streets with the keeper's guidance, learning what he could of the people sleeping beneath the plaza's careful gardens, families and engineers and archivists whose names and faces the keeper described with a tenderness that made clear it considered them, after 4 centuries of solitary vigil, something closer to kin than simple charges under its care. He filed his mining claim exactly as regulation required, but attached to it, at the keeper's careful instruction, a formal notation restricting any further access to the site pending review by appropriate diplomatic authorities, a legal maneuver Kettrik understood imperfectly, but trusted the keeper's centuries of patient study to have crafted correctly. He then did something no career prospector of his acquaintance had ever attempted, booking passage aboard a civilian transport bound for the nearest major way station, with sufficient diplomatic traffic to plausibly connect him with someone capable of reaching the Concordance Council directly. The way station, when he arrived, proved considerably more chaotic and considerably more difficult to navigate than any mining outpost he had spent his career working from, crowded with delegations and traders from a dozen species, none of whom had any particular reason to grant an unremarkable Drevathi prospector the kind of audience he now urgently required. He spent nearly 2 weeks working through official channels, filing requests that disappeared into bureaucratic queues with no clear timeline for response, growing increasingly aware that the keeper's 4 centuries of patience had trained it for a kind of waiting Kettrik himself possessed considerably less practice with. It was, in the end, a chance encounter in the way station's crowded transit lounge that finally broke the impasse, a conversation overheard rather than deliberately sought, between 2 junior diplomatic aides discussing, in low, careful voices, an upcoming concordance session concerning historical grievances and reparative justice for species who had suffered undocumented harm under older, less accountable galactic governance structures. Kettrik approached them directly, aware of how strange his interruption must appear, and explained, as concisely as he could manage, that he possessed information relevant to exactly the kind of historical grievance they were discussing, information involving humanity, a species he understood to already carry some standing interest within current concordance proceedings. The younger of the 2 aides, a sharp-eyed woman from a species Kettrik did not immediately recognize, studied him with evident skepticism before finally asking the question that would determine everything that followed. What exactly do you claim to know, Prospector, that a junior aide at a transit lounge should find worth interrupting her schedule for? I found a city, Kettrik said simply. Inside an asteroid, in a system so dead nobody's surveyed it properly in decades. A human city, sealed there 417 years ago, holding over 200,000 people still alive, still sleeping, waiting for a signal to wake that I don't believe is ever going to come through the channel they were told to expect it from. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Kettrik began to fear he had simply been dismissed as an eccentric attention seeker. Then the aide's expression shifted, sharp skepticism, giving way to something considerably more alert. I think, she said slowly, you had better come with me. I know someone who will want to hear this directly, and I suspect she will want to hear it today rather than through whatever bureaucratic queue you've presumably already exhausted. The someone in question proved to be Ambassador Renata Ape Solis herself, a name Kettrik recognized immediately from the keeper's own careful accounting of intercepted communications, the very diplomat whose recent work reaffirming humanity's protections under ancient galactic law had given the Keeper its first genuine hope in decades that the wider galaxy might finally have changed enough to make waking safe. Ape Solis received him within the hour, in a modest office crowded with data terminals and half-finished correspondence, her expression carrying the particular focused intensity of someone who had spent a career learning to recognize when an unlikely claim deserved serious attention rather than polite dismissal. "Tell me everything," she said, once introductions were complete. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out, Prospector, however small it seems. If what you're describing is real, I need to understand it completely before I decide how to proceed." Kettrik told her everything, the survey scan that shouldn't have returned a hollow reading, 6 days of careful drilling, the plaza and its overgrown gardens, the Keeper's patient, 4th-century vigil, the war that had apparently followed humanity's re-emergence into galactic society and been thoroughly erased from every record Kettrik's own archives maintained. Ape Solis listened without interrupting, her expression growing steadily more troubled as the account unfolded, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I need to be honest with you, Prospector," she said finally. "I have spent considerable time in recent years investigating gaps in humanity's historical record, periods where documentation simply stops, or contradicts itself, or seems deliberately incomplete in ways that suggest something was actively suppressed rather than simply lost to time. I have never had confirmation of what you're describing, a conflict following humanity's resurfacing after the long withdrawal, 4 centuries past. But I have had suspicions, precisely because the silence surrounding that period has always felt too complete to be accidental." "You believe me," Kettrik said, something in his chest loosening slightly at the confirmation. "I believe your account deserves serious, immediate investigation," Ape Solis said carefully. "Belief and verification are different things, and I would be doing you and everyone sleeping in that sanctuary a disservice if I treated the two as interchangeable. But yes, Prospector, I believe you are telling me the truth as you understand it, and I believe the stakes of that truth, if confirmed, are significant enough to warrant moving quickly." She moved, in fact, with a speed that surprised even Kettrik, who had spent 2 frustrating weeks learning exactly how slowly official channels typically processed even urgent matters. Within days, Ape Solis had assembled a small, carefully vetted team, historians and legal scholars specializing in the very old galactic frameworks the Keeper had referenced, along with a discreet security escort chosen specifically for their proven discretion rather than their rank, and arranged passage back to the dead system where Kettrik's asteroid still sat, its hidden passage sealed once more at the Keeper's own careful instruction, awaiting confirmation before it would open for anyone again. The journey back gave Kettrik considerable time to speak further with Ape Solis, learning, in turn, something of the careful, painstaking work she had done in years past reaffirming humanity's ancient legal standing, work that had apparently involved its own dangerous confrontations with parties determined to keep certain historical truths buried. "I begin to suspect," she told him, during one long conversation in the ship's cramped observation lounge, "that humanity's history contains rather more of these buried chapters than anyone, myself included, has yet fully appreciated. Every time I think I've uncovered the full truth of some ancient injustice, I find another thread leading toward something else concealed, something else quietly erased by parties who found the truth inconvenient to their interests. I confess I find your sanctuary's existence both deeply troubling and, in a strange way, deeply unsurprising." "Do you think the people responsible for the original war are still out there?" Kettrik asked. "Still powerful enough to threaten these people if they wake?" "I don't yet know," Ape Solis admitted. "That is precisely what we need to determine before we authorize anything as consequential as waking 200,000 people who have been asleep long enough that the entire political landscape they last knew has almost certainly changed beyond recognition. I would rather move carefully and correctly than quickly and recklessly, however much urgency I feel on their behalf. Upon reaching the system, Ape Solis' team spent nearly 3 weeks in careful, methodical investigation, the Keeper granting them cautious, limited access to its own preserved archives, once Kettrik vouched personally for the diplomat's trustworthiness. Historians cross-referencing the Keeper's 4-century-old records against whatever fragmentary confirmation could be found in wider galactic archives. Legal scholars painstakingly reconstructing the terms of the ancient settlement the Keeper described, searching for any surviving documentation of the coalition responsible for the original conflict, and what, if anything, remained of their power in the current political landscape. The findings, when finally compiled, proved considerably more complicated than anyone had hoped. The specific coalition responsible for the war against humanity's reemergence had, over the intervening 4 centuries, largely dissolved, its constituent powers absorbed, fragmented, or transformed into entities that bore little structural resemblance to their ancient predecessors. This was, on balance, encouraging news, suggesting the specific threat that had necessitated the sanctuary's construction no longer existed in any organized, actionable form. But the investigation also surfaced something considerably more troubling, evidence suggesting that certain descendant institutions, corporate and political bodies that had inherited resources, territory, and in some cases leadership lineages from the original coalition members, still harbored institutional memory of the ancient conflict, and might well view the sudden reappearance of over 200,000 humans holding claims to territory and resources the intervening centuries had allowed other parties to quietly absorb, as a serious and unwelcome complication. This is precisely the concern the Keeper anticipated, Ape Solis told Kettrik, once the findings were assembled. Even without a unified hostile coalition capable of renewing outright war, we may be looking at determined, well-resourced opposition to this population's reintegration, opposition that would prefer, quite understandably from their own narrow interests, that these people simply remain asleep forever, their claims and their history conveniently forgotten. Then what do we do? Kettrik asked. The Keeper won't wake anyone without confirmation this is safe. If it isn't safe, are we just supposed to leave them sleeping? No, Ape Solis said, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. But I think we need to approach this carefully, building the same kind of formal, verified case before the Concordance Council that I once needed to reaffirm humanity's broader legal standing. Not simply announcing this population's existence and hoping for the best, but securing formal, binding protections and legal recognition before we ever authorize their waking, so that whatever opposition emerges finds itself confronting an already established legal reality, rather than an ambiguous situation still open to manipulation. It was Kettrik himself, drawing on instincts honed across 32 cycles of careful negotiation over disputed mineral claims, who suggested the approach that would eventually prove decisive. You need proof that matters to the whole council, not just to humanity, he said. The Keeper has 4 centuries of records. If even a fraction of those records document injustices that touch on other species too, allies who were harmed by the same coalition, or legal principles that would matter to the concordance regardless of who benefits, that's a case that doesn't rely on anyone feeling charitable toward humanity specifically. It's a case about whether the Council's own laws mean anything at all. Ape Solis considered that carefully, and something in her expression suggested she had not fully anticipated a prospector's practical, transactional instincts proving quite so useful. That is, she said slowly, an excellent suggestion. Let's see what the Keeper's archives actually contain. What the Keeper's archives ultimately revealed, once its full 4 centuries of carefully preserved records were finally open to formal review, proved more significant than even Ape Solis had anticipated. Buried within the keeper's meticulous documentation of the original conflict was clear evidence that the coalition's campaign against humanity's reemergence had violated several specific, binding provisions of ancient galactic law still formally recognized by the modern concordance. Provisions concerning the treatment of civilian populations during declared conflicts. Provisions whose violation implicated not only humanity's specific grievance, but established legal precedent relevant to several other species who had suffered under similarly unaccountable ancient power structures. The case Ape Solis eventually built before the Concordance Council, months later, argued not simply for the protection of one sleeping human population, but for the Council's own institutional credibility, framing the sanctuary's discovery as a test of whether modern galactic governance actually possessed the will to enforce its own foundational principles, when doing so proved inconvenient to established, comfortable interests. The hearing itself unfolded with less open hostility than Kettrik had feared, though the underlying tension proved, if anything, more uncomfortable for its quiet, procedural politeness. Several delegations, representing the descendant institutions Ape Solis' investigation, had identified as inheritors of the original coalition's resources and territory, raised careful, measured objections concerning the practical complications of reintegrating over 200,000 people, whose historical territorial claims had, over 4 centuries, become deeply entangled with subsequent settlements and developments. The Council is being asked, argued one particularly measured representative from a species called the Voth Collective, not simply to authorize a humanitarian act, however sympathetic, but to unsettle 4 centuries of subsequent legal and territorial arrangements that countless parties, entirely innocent of the original conflict's injustices, have built their lives and livelihoods upon in good faith. I do not dispute the tragedy of what was done to these people. I question whether righting an old wrong justifies the disruption such a righting would necessarily cause to considerably more recent, considerably more innocent arrangements. Kettrik, called to testify directly regarding the discovery itself, found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, offering the response that ultimately proved most persuasive to the assembled council. "I understand the concern about disruption," he said, standing before the full assembly with considerably less polish than any trained diplomat might have offered, but with the plain, unadorned honesty that had already served him well once before. "I'm a prospector. My whole career is built on finding value in things other people have already written off, and I understand better than most people in this chamber how uncomfortable it is when something long settled turns out to still have a rightful owner. But I'd ask the Council to consider this. 211,000 people are sleeping right now, trusting a machine that's kept faith with them for 400 years, waiting for someone to finally tell them it's safe to wake up. Every day this council spends weighing whether their return is convenient for people who have had 4 centuries to settle into land and resources those 200,000 people never agreed to give up. Is another day those sleeping families lose that they'll never get back. I'd ask you to consider whose inconvenience actually deserves more of your sympathy." The ruling, when it finally came, granted formal legal recognition to the sanctuary's population, established binding protections against any territorial or resource claims that might otherwise complicate their reintegration, and authorized a structured, carefully managed process for their eventual waking, to be overseen jointly by Concordance representatives and humanity's own current diplomatic authorities, ensuring the population would return not into legal limbo, but into a framework specifically designed to protect their interests. Waking itself, when it finally began months later, proceeded in careful stages under the keeper's own meticulous guidance. Small groups revived first to help the intelligence, and its human specialists refined the process before the larger population followed. Kettrik was present for the very first waking. Standing quietly at the edge of the plaza, He had once walked alone in stunned silence, watching as a woman who had been asleep for 417 years opened her eyes for the first time in a lifespan that had somehow spanned two entirely different eras of galactic history. She looked around slowly, taking in the overgrown gardens, the soft ambient light, the small crowd of unfamiliar faces gathered respectfully at a careful distance, and finally settled her gaze on the small pulsing crystal. The keeper's physical housing had been carefully relocated to stand beside her waking chamber. "Keeper," she said, her voice rough with centuries of disuse but steady nonetheless. "How long?" 417 years, the keeper said gently. "I am sorry it took so long, but I think, if you'll permit me to say so, that it is finally truly safe." The woman was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the scope of what she had just been told, before her gaze moved to Kettrik himself, standing at the edge of the gathering with the same careful, respectful stillness he had learned, over the preceding months, to associate with moments too significant for anything but patient silence. "Who found us?" she asked. "A prospector," the keeper said, cracking open what he believed was an ordinary, worthless rock. The woman studied Kettrik for a long moment, something complicated moving across her expression, centuries of loss and hope and uncertainty compressed into a single searching look. "Thank you," she said finally, "for looking twice." Kettrik, who had spent 32 cycles building an entire career on the simple, practical instinct of looking twice at things everyone else had already dismissed, found he had no adequate response to offer beyond a quiet nod, understanding, in that moment, that he had just witnessed something considerably larger than any mineral discovery he could ever have hoped to make. Over the following year, the sanctuary's population woke in careful, staged waves, each group emerging into a galaxy considerably changed from the one they had last known, guided patiently by concordance liaisons and by humanity's own current diplomatic representatives, who arrived in growing numbers as word of the discovery spread through careful, controlled channels designed to prevent the kind of chaotic, uncontrolled exposure that might have overwhelmed a population already adjusting to 4 centuries of lost time. Kettrik himself remained involved throughout, granted, at his own request rather than for any reward he had sought, a formal role as liaison between the awakening population and the wider concordance bureaucracy managing their reintegration, a position that drew, more than once, on exactly the practical, patient instincts that had once served him well, cracking open rocks nobody else wanted. He found, in the months that followed, that he had grown genuinely fond of the small, tightly knit community slowly re-establishing itself within the asteroid's hollow interior. Families and engineers and archivists whose lives had been interrupted mid-sentence 4 centuries ago, and were now, carefully and deliberately, resuming, layered awkwardly but hopefully atop a galaxy that had moved on considerably without them. The keeper, freed at last from 4 centuries of solitary vigil, remained active within the community it had protected for so long, no longer a lone guardian but something closer to a respected elder, consulted regularly by the awakening population for its careful memory of exactly what had been lost, and exactly what had, against considerable odds, finally been recovered. "I confess," the keeper told Kettrik, during one of their regular conversations nearly a year after that first tense encounter in the quiet chamber beneath the plaza, "that I did not fully believe, even after making the decision to trust you, that this outcome was genuinely possible. 4 centuries of solitary vigilance teaches a certain caution about hoping too openly for the best outcome. I am glad, Prospector, to have been wrong about the limits of what might still be achieved." "I nearly walked away the first time you spoke to me," Kettrik admitted. "I told myself I was here for a mineral survey, and everything after that was someone else's problem to solve. I'm glad I didn't." "So am I," the keeper said. "Though I think, in fairness, you were never quite as simple a prospector as you like to describe yourself. A man entirely satisfied with cracking open worthless rocks does not spend 6 careful days widening a passage, instead of simply walking away from an anomaly his instruments couldn't fully explain. Some part of you, I think, was always looking for exactly this kind of discovery, even before you understood what you were looking for. Kettrik considered that for a long moment, watching the plaza's gardens, tended now by careful hands rather than left to overgrown wildness. Children who had slept through 4 centuries running between beds of flowers, their own grandparents had planted a lifetime ago that had somehow, impossibly, become the same lifetime again. Maybe, he said finally, I always did like finding out what a thing was really worth, underneath everything that made it look ordinary. I just never expected the answer to be quite this large. The story of the sanctuary's discovery spread, in time, well beyond the careful, controlled channels that had first managed its revelation, becoming, across the wider galaxy, a case study cited in exactly the kind of legal and diplomatic circles Ape Solis had once hoped it might influence. Evidence that ancient injustices, however thoroughly buried, however carefully erased from comfortable historical record, retain the capacity to resurface and demand accounting, given enough patience. And given, crucially, someone willing to look twice at what everyone else had already decided was worthless. Humanity, in the years that followed, absorbed its recovered population not as a strange, disruptive anomaly, but as a genuine, celebrated homecoming. The sanctuary itself eventually transformed, at its awakened community's own request, into a protected historical site, its plaza and gardens preserved as a permanent memorial to 4 centuries of patient waiting, and to the ordinary prospector who had, cracking open what he believed, was simply an unremarkable asteroid. Found instead an entire city, and an entire population, worth considerably more than any mineral claim he had ever filed before. Kettrik Voss Ambrai never returned to prospecting in quite the same way after that. He kept his mining license technically, but found himself drawn, increasingly, toward the same careful, patient work of recovery and reunion that had defined his single greatest discovery, understanding now, in a way 32 cycles of ordinary prospecting had never quite taught him, that the most valuable things in the galaxy were rarely the ones that announced themselves plainly on a survey scan, but the ones buried quietly beneath layers of neglect and forgotten history, waiting patiently for exactly the right person to look twice, and to keep looking, long after everyone else would have already turned away.